He said it the way you'd say pass the butter. Calm, flat. Like it wasn't a threat at all, just a fact he was sharing with me, in my own kitchen, in the house I have lived in for 31 years. Mom, we need you to cover Melissa's line of credit, $240,000, or we're going to have to make some changes around here. I remember setting down my mug. I remember the sound it made on the granite counter, the one his father and I picked out together at a showroom in Mississauga, the summer before he got sick. I remember thinking how strange it was that a sound so small could exist inside a moment so enormous. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at my son, my only son, who I had driven to hockey practice at 5 in the morning through January storms, who I had sat up with through 2 rounds of university applications, who I had nursed back from a bad breakup at 26, with soup and bad television, and I nodded. Once. Let me think about it, I said. He nodded back like that was reasonable, like he had just asked me to lend him a parking spot. He walked out of the kitchen. I heard him go upstairs, heard the bedroom door close, heard Melissa's voice through the ceiling, low and quick, like she was waiting for a report. I stood there alone in my kitchen for a long time after that. My son's name is Trevor. He is 43 years old. He has his father's height and his grandmother's stubbornness, and, until about 2 years ago, I would have told you he had a good heart. I still think part of him does. I have to believe that, even now. He met Melissa at a conference in Calgary 6 years ago. She works in finance. Or she did. She had a confident handshake and a way of speaking that made everything sound like a decision already made. I noticed it at their first dinner at my house, when she rearranged the serving dishes on my dining table without asking. I told myself she was just nervous. I told myself I was being too sensitive. My husband passed in 2019, pancreatic cancer, 13 months from diagnosis to the end. After he died, the house felt very large. Trevor started calling more often, which I appreciated. Then he mentioned that he and Melissa were thinking of leaving their condo in Brampton. The lease was up. The market was brutal. Could they stay with me for a few months, just until they found something? I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. That was 22 months ago. The first few weeks were fine, or they seemed fine. Melissa was polite in a distant way. She kept to herself mostly. I cooked dinners and she said, "Thank you," and Trevor seemed happier than he had been in a while, which made me happy. Then small things began to shift. She rearranged the spice shelf. That was first. I didn't say anything. Then she moved the furniture in the living room. Just a few inches, she said, to improve the flow. And I didn't say anything about that either. Then she started buying groceries and putting things in the refrigerator that I would have to move to find my own. Then she started having her friends over on Wednesday evenings without mentioning it to me. I would come home from my book club to find strangers in my living room and an open bottle of wine that nobody had offered me. I told Trevor I felt a little crowded. He listened carefully, the way he always does, and then he said, "Melissa's trying her best, Mom. She's going through a lot right now. Could you maybe just give her a little more space? Give her more in my house." I did not say that out loud. I said, "Of course," and I went to my room. That was when the space started to shrink. Not physically. I want to be clear about that. But I started to feel it. That sense of being a guest somewhere you own. I would walk into a room and the conversation would pause in a way that made me feel I had interrupted something. I would make a comment at dinner, and there would be a small silence, and then they would move on, like I hadn't spoken. When Melissa's parents came to visit from Vancouver, they stayed for a long weekend. They used my bathroom without asking. Her mother called my kitchen cozy in a tone that meant something else entirely. I started eating breakfast earlier, before they came down. It was easier. I found out about the debt by accident. I was in the home office, which had been my husband's office, which still has his bookshelves and his old desk lamp, printing something off when a letter came through the door slot. I picked it up. It was addressed to Melissa, but the return address was a collections agency in Toronto. The envelope had been opened already and then folded shut again. I didn't read it. I left it on the kitchen counter. But that evening, Melissa was on her phone near the hallway, speaking quietly, and I caught fragments. "They can't keep calling me at this number, and it's not my fault the fund collapsed, and Trevor says his mother might help." His mother might help. I went upstairs and sat on my bed and thought for a long time about what that meant, about how long that conversation had been happening without me, about the fact that they had apparently already decided the answer before anyone had asked me the question. A week later, Trevor came into the kitchen and asked me to pass the butter. After the kitchen conversation, after he told me to pay Melissa's line of credit or they would make changes, I did something I had not done in 20 years. I called a lawyer. Her name is Sandra Okafor, and she works out of a small office in Oakville, and she was recommended to me by a woman in my book club whose sister had gone through something similar. I did not tell Trevor. I drove there on a Tuesday afternoon and told Sandra the whole thing, start to finish. She asked me several questions. She was direct and she was kind, and she did not make me feel foolish for not having acted sooner. She told me my rights. She told me what it meant legally for them to be living in my home with no formal rental agreement. She told me what I could do and what the timeline looked like and what the risks were. I drove home feeling something I had not felt in months. Not exactly relief, more like the memory of what it had felt like to have ground under my feet. I want to tell you about a morning in February, about 6 weeks after the kitchen conversation. I had come downstairs early, around 7, and I was standing at the counter making my coffee when Melissa came in. She was already dressed, already sharp-looking, already on her phone. She glanced at me once, then looked at the counter and said, without putting down her phone, "We're switching to oat milk. The regular milk is gone." That was it. No question. No, do you mind? Just a statement about my refrigerator, in my house, delivered like a memo. I stood there. I felt something move through me. Not anger exactly, but something old and certain. Like a door closing quietly somewhere inside. I said, "I'll pick up whatever milk I like, dear." She looked up from her phone then. Just briefly. Something passed across her face. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of irritation. She didn't say anything else. She walked out. I finished making my coffee. I stood at my kitchen window and looked out at my backyard, at the bird feeder my husband had put up the spring before he got sick, at the oak tree that loses its leaves last every autumn, and I made my decision, not the one they were waiting for. Sandra had explained the process carefully. Because there was no formal lease, because they were guests in my home, not legal tenants, the situation was different than it might have been otherwise. I still had to follow a process. I still had to give proper notice. But the house was mine, had always been mine, was in my name alone since my husband passed, and we had sorted the estate. I had done nothing to transfer that. What I did over the next few weeks, I did quietly. I had a meeting with my financial advisor at TD. I updated my will. I moved certain accounts. I signed documents. I had a second meeting with Sandra, and we went through everything in detail, and she walked me through what the next step would look like and what I should have ready. I also called my sister, who lives in Sudbury. I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "How long have you been sitting on this?" And I said, "A while." She said, "Come stay with me when it's time." I told her I would. I did not tell Trevor any of this. He came to me again in March. It was a Sunday evening. Melissa was upstairs. He sat down at the kitchen table, which was unusual. He rarely sat, usually stood when he had something to say, like a man who intended to leave quickly. And he said he needed an answer. I asked him what would happen if I said no. He said they would have to explore options. He said the house was large, and there were ways to make things more manageable financially. He said something about refinancing, about my equity, about what the house might be worth in the current market. He said it all in a reasonable voice, like he was presenting a budget proposal to a board, and I sat across from him, and I thought, I do not know this version of my son. I'm not sure I want to. I said, I understand. Let me sleep on it. He seemed satisfied. He went back upstairs. I sat at my kitchen table for an hour. I could hear them talking up there, low voices, the occasional word coming through the floor. I thought about my husband, about what he would have said if he were sitting across from me in that kitchen, in that chair. I thought he would have been calm. I think he would have said, "You already know what you're doing. You've known for a while." He was usually right about those things. I left on a Wednesday. I didn't pack dramatically. I didn't make a scene. I had been moving things out gradually for 2 weeks. Clothes in small amounts. The photographs that mattered most. My husband's watch. The box of letters I've kept from my mother. I did it in the morning, before they were awake, in the weeks when they slept in late. The morning I left, I made myself one last coffee. I stood at my window and looked at the bird feeder. I washed my mug and dried it and put it away. I left an envelope on the kitchen counter. It was addressed to Trevor in my handwriting. Inside was a letter from Sandra's office. It was a formal notice. It outlined their legal status in the home, the terms of their required departure, and the date by which they needed to vacate. It was clear and correct and entirely within my rights. Sandra had reviewed every word. I picked up my keys. I took my overnight bag. I walked out my own front door, locked it behind me, got in my car, and drove north on the 400 towards Sudbury. I did not cry until I hit Barry. Then I cried for about 40 minutes, and after that I felt something I hadn't felt in almost 2 years. I felt like myself again. My sister made pasta that night. We sat at her kitchen table, which is small and cluttered and warm, which is entirely hers. And she poured us each a glass of wine, and she didn't ask me too many questions. She just let me be there. My phone began ringing around 7 that evening. Trevor. I watched it ring. Then Melissa called twice in a row. Then Trevor again. I turned it face down and finished my pasta. I eventually picked up, 2 days later. I was ready by then, which mattered. Trevor was not calm, which was new. He said the letter had blindsided him. He said he couldn't believe I would do this without warning. He said he had never expected me to go this far. I let him talk. I have learned, over 68 years, that there is a point in a conversation where the other person has to run out of steam before anything real can be said. When he finished, I said, "Trevor, I gave you months of warning. You heard what you chose to hear." He was quiet. I said, "I love you. I will always love you, but that house is my home, and no one, not you, not your wife, not a line of credit I have nothing to do with, Gets to make me a stranger in it. Another silence. Then he said quietly, I didn't think you'd actually leave. I know, I said. That was the problem. They were out by the date specified in the letter. I don't know exactly where they went. I believe they found a rental in Brampton, near where they were before. Trevor texted me on the day they left. He said, House is clear. Took good care of it. I believed him about that part. I drove home on a Saturday in April. The highway was just starting to turn green at the edges, that pale early color that comes before everything else. I drove alone with the radio on, and the windows cracked a little, even though it was still cold. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a minute. Just sat there, looking at the front of my house. The same blue door I painted myself 3 summers ago, the same window boxes that need new flowers every spring. I went inside. It smelled like my house again. I can't explain exactly what I mean by that, except that it did, and I noticed it immediately. I went to the kitchen. I put my coffee mug on my counter, and I looked out at the backyard. The bird feeder was still there. The oak tree had a few early buds on it. I called Sandra the next morning to say thank you and to finalize a few remaining details. She said, You handled it with a great deal of grace. I said I wasn't always sure about that. She said, Grace doesn't mean you weren't scared. It just means you kept going anyway. I think about that sometimes. Trevor and I are not estranged. I want to be careful about how I say that, because it doesn't mean things are the same as they were, or that the path back is short. But we have spoken several times since April. We have had a few difficult conversations and a few almost normal ones. He came to have coffee with me last month, alone without Melissa, and he sat at my kitchen table and looked out at the backyard and he said, after a while, Dad would have hated how I handled this. I said, yes, he would have. Trevor nodded. I think I knew that, and I didn't want to. I refilled his coffee. We sat together for a while in the quiet of the kitchen, and it was not fixed. Nothing was fixed, but it was honest, and honest is somewhere to start from. I am 68 years old. I have lived in this house for 31 years. I raised a child in it, buried a husband from it, and kept a bird feeder going through 17 Canadian winters. I paid for every floor, every window, every coat of paint. I know what I was willing to give away and what I was not. My son asked me to choose between my money and my home. He never thought to ask what it cost me to be made, to feel invisible in the place I had built my whole life inside of. That was the thing that was never on the table, because I never put it there. I stayed quiet too long, and I know that now. I thought silence was kindness. I confused keeping the peace with keeping myself small. It is not the same thing. It is not the same thing at all. If you have given someone a key to your home, a real key, or just an open door you never thought to close, and they have started locking you out of your own rooms, I want you to hear this. Quiet is not the same as consent. Waiting is not the same as accepting. You are allowed to leave, even when it's your house, because sometimes leaving is the only way to make clear what was always yours. I came back to mine, and I am not moving again.